As they crossed into the spirit land, strange things started happening. First, a man came and took back the legs he had lent to the skull. Then another took his head, and one by one, all the borrowed parts were returned. Soon the skull was just a plain old skull again. Adago was terrified and wanted to go back. Once upon a time in a town called Cobham, there lived a man named Ekong Edet. Ekong had a daughter named Adago. Adago was so beautiful that all the young men in the town wanted to marry her. They would come with gifts and pleas, but Adago, she was a bit proud. She said she would only marry a man who was handsome, strong, and who truly loved her. Many of the men her parents suggested were rich but old and not very good-looking. This made Adago sad because she didn't want to disobey her parents, but she also didn't want to marry someone she didn't love. Meanwhile, in the spirit land, there was a skull who heard about Adago's beauty. This skull wanted to have her for himself. So he asked his friends in the spirit land to help him. One friend gave him a good head, another a strong body. Someone else gave him powerful arms, and finally, another friend lent him fine legs. When all these parts were put together, the skull looked like the most perfect man anyone had ever seen. One day, the skull came down to Cobham Market. Adago heard about this handsome stranger and went to see him. As soon as she laid eyes on the skull with his borrowed beauty, she fell deeply in love. She invited him to her home, and he gladly went. When they arrived, Adago introduced the skull to her parents, and he asked for their blessing to marry her. At first, her parents were unsure because he was a stranger, but eventually they agreed because the skull seemed like such a perfect man. They lived happily together in Ekong's house for 2 days, and then the skull said it was time to go to his homeland far away. Adago was excited to be with such a fine man, but her parents were worried. They asked their spiritual guide, who revealed that the skull was from the spirit land, and if Adago went with him, she would likely never return. Despite their warnings, Adago was determined. So they set off on their journey. As they crossed into the spirit land, strange things started happening. First, a man came and took back the legs he had lent to the skull. Then another took his head, and one by one, all the borrowed parts were returned. Soon the skull was just a plain old skull again. Adago was terrified and wanted to go back, but the skull insisted they continue. When they reached the skull's house, they found his mother, an old woman who could barely move. Adago, being kind-hearted, helped the old woman with chores and care. The old woman grew to love Adago and warned her that the people in the spirit land were cannibals. She promised to help Adago return home safely if she promised to obey her parents in the future. Adago agreed, and the old woman called upon the wind to take her home. At first, a fierce storm came, but the old woman sent it away. Then a gentle breeze arrived, and the old woman asked it to take Adago home. The breeze carried her swiftly, and soon Adago found herself outside her home. Her parents were overjoyed to see her, as they had thought her lost forever. Her father laid soft animal skins on the ground for her to walk on so her feet wouldn't touch the dirt. Adago walked to her house, where her father called all her friends to come and celebrate. There was feasting and dancing for 8 days and nights. After the celebrations, Adago's father went to the town chief and told him what happened. The chief then made a rule that daughters should not marry strangers from faraway lands. Adago's father then suggested she marry a friend of his, and she agreed. They lived happily, had many children, and Adago always remembered to obey her parents. And so the town of Cobham learned the importance of listening to parents and being careful with strangers, especially those who seem too good to be true.